Hello, The White Hart by Nancy Springer. This is not an easy book to review, and this is not my first attempt, but let's start with the Corgi edition that I'm holding right now. It's a rather beautiful one. The artwork is great. I still can't find out who did the artwork, by the way. I have checked. On the cover, maybe I didn't check very well. Tell me if you know. On the cover we've got a dragon curled around a hoard of golden items, in which there is a sword and a crown, and opposite him on some rather beautiful boulders stands what appears to be a hobbit. Spoiler, not a hobbit, human being. The artwork wraps around to the back where we've got a, again, well-drawn and highly reflective, apparently, horde of horsemen riding through what looks like boulders, but given the story, I'd say it's probably billows of smoke. Great looking little book which I picked up recently, and I picked it up because, hold that thought, this time I wanted to read Nancy Springer's Isle books in order, and I already had this one. Nancy Springer is an author who has been writing since the 70s, I'm going to say. This one is from 78. I think she was born just before the 50s. She's been writing, she's still writing. She's an American author. And you may have heard of a streaming service, it might have been Netflix, did a series recently called Enola Holmes. The idea is that there is a young female relative of the famous Sherlock Holmes. She's apparently got the gene to solve mysteries, and she's doing that. It's sourced from a whole heap of young adult books. Nancy Springer these days writes young adult. There's the Enola Holmes, and before that she started in the early 2000s, I think it was, with a series called Rowan of Sherlock. This is Robin Hood, only it's a young girl again. That's a very fashionable thing that lots of people are doing. It's very young adulty. I think I did briefly look at an Enola book after I realised that it was Nancy Springer writing them, but I thought it looked a little bit too young for even my fairly eclectic tastes. My eclectic tastes, omnivorous reader. These days I'm reading a lot of science fiction. Mostly classic science fiction, but a fair bit of new. That wasn't always the case. There was a brief period there when I read predominantly and almost exclusively fantasy, and that was when I knew Nancy Springer. I'd say that was probably in the 90s. Early 90s, maybe. Anyhow, because back at the time I didn't bother trying to get series and there wasn't internet anyway, so you couldn't tell what a series was, I've read something else from the Isles, but as a standalone, and I haven't read them in order. This time I was determined to read them in order, so instead of reading The Silver Sun, which I really wanted to when I got it, I waited for the first one, and that is The White Hart. And I have read it, and it's really hard to review. I'd say it's probably dated. And I'd say it's a bit overlooked on today's market of fantasy readers. If you love classic fantasy and you haven't read Nancy Springer and her Isles trilogy, I think you probably should. If no other reason, because Goodreads only has 676 ratings of this classic book and only 61 reviews. If you compare that to her Enola Holmes, little girl riding a bicycle books, whatever they are, young adulty, because apparently 14-year-olds are young adults these days. I've met some 14-year-olds. I debate that. That one has in the thousands of ratings and hundreds of reviews. So I'd say Springer's early work is not being looked at enough. This could arguably be considered young adult, and I think at times it has been. I don't think it is. I think it's more suited for the adult classic fantasy reader. Simply, it's only because it's very, very Arthurian in its pacing, and that's a type of pacing and a detached style of writing that I don't think most young adults are going to bond with these days. Come on, dinosaur. Come on, say hello to the camera. This is the pretty bird in the videos. So young adult or not, I don't think so. But it lacks those things that are apparently the keynotes of young adults. There's wars, but they're kind of ambiguous. People die, but it doesn't tear your heartstrings out. There's no real sex, so I can't I can't remember any sex, and the romance is heavily Arthurian, classical, and implied. On to the story. Well, that's a good question. So we start out, and this is the part that really intrigued me at the beginning of this book. We start out with a maiden captive in a tower. And that seems to me very reminiscent of a book that I read a long time ago, and I cannot remember what it was. It was a classic style, like, I don't know, Chaucer, Lord Byron. I can't remember who it was, but it starts off in this very, very classic writing style with a maiden Celtic, Saxon, something like that. Pretty sure it was a Saxon. Beautiful maiden in her tall stone tower, but do not envy the Saxon princess her tower, because it is drafty and poorly built. That was the main thing that I carried away from that book, along with the feeling that I may not be on board with this writer. If you have any idea what author I am talking about, I know there's people out there who read a lot more with classic stuff than I do. Please tell me what it is. I want to find it. I want to know what it is. I've been combing my bookshelves for 2 days trying to figure out what it was that I read about this Saxon maiden in her tower. We start with a Celtic maiden in her tower. Ellard, to rhyme with Gelad, has been taken captive by some fierce brutes who are below in the tower while they've left her captive up the top. We don't know at this stage exactly what we want from her, but we know that she is noble and beautiful, and will not let them see her fear or cry in front of them, etc., etc. From this impossible tower, who no one knows that she's there, because her father, Price de Cairan, who is a regional lord, he's off somewhere in the southern lands, I think it is. There's no way he could have found her by now. But suddenly, mysteriously, this unknown youth appears at her window. He tears off the iron bars, which seems a bit supernaturally sorcery-ish to me, but they're iron, so it can't be fairy, unless I'm wrong. He creeps into the cell, releases her, lets her down a rope, covers her nakedness with his tunic. Okay, no, I'm not going to say it. Not on YouTube. And then he climbs down the rope after her, pulls on the rope and comes after her. I'm feeling Tolkien vibes with the elven rope following Sam around the Darklands trying to get to Mordor. If you like Tolkien and you like Arthurian legend, you will see a lot of similarities here. So her mysterious rescuer ends up being Bevan. It takes her a lot of pages to coax his name out of him, but he's Bevan. And eventually we figure out that the Isles used to have a king, and his name was Biv, something like that. Right in the center of the Isles there. And I still think that drawing looks like a tree fungus, but well done on creating a Celtic-style legend where the sea, instead of being the focus of the whole civilization, is an outlier to be feared, because a lot of early civilizations did feel that way about the sea. Well done, Nancy Springer. Where was I? Oh yes, so Bevan's father used to be the High King of the Isle. He's believed dead at this long battle yonks and yonks ago. Only Bevan tells Ellard that instead he was rescued from the battle and taken below to this area that is like this underworld kingdom where gods live, no one ever dies, there's magic. His mother's a goddess, and he was fathered down there after the king, who is still alive and healthy, by the way, though a bit old, got there. Okay, so Bevan's this half god come to Earth, which he's kind of mourning because it means he's mortal and he's going to die, which is apparently a bad thing. Most of us seem to think so. And as he's wandering around, sooner or later everyone finds out that Bevan is the inheritor of this old king, and the war in which his father allegedly died was actually against an ancient evil that might have been once a god, or it's definitely a sorcerer. It's called Pel, and this immortal bad guy is creating undead using a magic cauldron down in the south. So of course this ends up being a battle of good and evil, with the final triumphant battle. We know it's triumphant, don't we? It's like we've We've read fantasy. We know how Arthurian legend type quests tend to go. So Bevan and Pell end up fighting, and Bevan ends up winning, but all is not well with Bevan. So Ellard fell in love with Bevan after she rescued him from her captive tower. He takes her back to his father, honestly and with chivalry, whatever. It's early. What can I say? Where she meets Cuan, son of Claric, who is her intended. They're not actually engaged, but everyone thinks they're going to get married because he's in love with her and she's there, and apparently that's enough for them to get married or whatever. Cuan is actually her cousin as such, because the way of this land is for a lord like her father, the Karen, to bequeath his lands not to his son but to his sister's son. So it stays in the family, the genetic line is preserved, but a level of autonomy and power is introduced on the woman's behalf as well. And I like that world building on the part of Springer. In a small dig, she mentions that this women's power is now slowly eroding. Anyway, Cuan's pushed into the cold when Ellard falls in love with Bevan, but later Cuan sort of falls in love with Bevan as well. There's a real bromance as the two of them walk the length and breadth of the Isles, and that's what most of this book is. This is the two young men questing around, meeting people, shaking hands, kissing babies, or maybe kissing babies, shaking hands, whatever they're doing, to raise the army that Bevan needs to march on Pell, who is the bad guy, and eventually that happens. In the meantime, Ellard's fallen in love with Bevan. Her father's keen on her being the next queen, though he's going such kind of weird and is obviously going to try and betray Bevan eventually. Cuan is out in the cold, but he's being very nice about it, really. It's fantasy questing. If you like fantasy questing written in the old style, it's for you. But I think those very few ratings on Goodreads indicate that for many people this is aged poorly. And unless you like that particular style of fantasy, you may not like it. If fantasy, however, is your jam, and you like reading the older style, and you like Celtic mythology, and you like Arthurian legends, then I really think you should try the Isles. Not enough people are. However, as I think I've already said in one of the videos, maybe not this one because I keep trying to finish this one. It's not looking. Back in the day when I read Nancy Springer, probably in the 90s, possibly when this was published in the 80s. This Cordier edition is the first UK edition, but it was first published in 79. Copyright 79. What was I saying? So when it first came out, it was very well known, it was very well read, and it was very lauded before the internet. I don't know. I'm not blaming the internet, I'm just saying. On the cover, Marion Zimmer Bradley wrote a endorsement saying that in a class with Donaldson's Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, ignore that. The Donaldson's Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, which we all absolutely adored when they came out, they have dated very badly. And recently I tried to reread them and I just can't. They are so out of step with the time. They start with a sexual assault. You can't read them. This is as far from that as you can go. It's very readable. What it doesn't have is that imminency, that strong character-reader bond that you're going to see in most fantasy today. But it's very readable for what it is. On the back, we've got Anne McCaffrey endorsing it as well. I'd say this is more like Anne McCaffrey. Nancy Springer, like McCaffrey, knew how to write, and she wrote very well indeed. Which I can't say about all fantasy authors. Anyhow, if you're into fantasy and you haven't read The Isles, I think you should definitely read The White Hart at least. I was going to move straight on from this to the Silver Sun. Okay, so, spoilers. You can end now if you want to, but is it a spoiler when it's this long ago? I don't know. In the end, Bevan doesn't marry Ellard and raise a whole parcel of Celtic next royalty. He doesn't rebuild the ancient city that was the centre of ruling of the Isles. He doesn't do any of those things. Early on, he's given this prophecy that he should avoid the sea. A prophecy that's given in a lot of fantasy. I don't know. Tolkien did the same thing. I feel that Tolkien must have been someone that Nancy Springer just loved reading, and a lot of his themes crept in there, including the dragon and the pile of gold and the not hobbit. That's Bevan, by the way. I'm pretty sure that the way he's described in the book, he wasn't a hobbit. So you've got the silver rope, you've got the Tolkien-esque hoard, and finally you've got Legolas's prophecy of you should avoid the sound of the sea because the sound of the gulls will stay on your heads forevermore, whatever. Only Legolas is a bit more balanced about it, and Bevan takes it a lot harder. He reaches the sea and turns into a zombie until he builds a ship. I'm going to say that's his magical, otherworldly, mystical, godlike powers, because if I went down to the shore and tried to build a ship, I'm swearing to you, it wouldn't go flying across to the horizon like Bevan does at the end of this book. Now, I had planned on going from this straight to number 2, but since Bevan isn't there, Allard and Cúin probably got married and had the brats that were going to appear in the next book. But I was exhausted from all the questing back and forth of the Isle with never stopping for a night's rest and never doing any laundry, so I needed a break from the Silver Sun. I'm moving on to Silverberg, I think. Silverberg's got the same nice writing, that same almost mythic style, but I think he'll be a good change of pace from Nancy Springer before I move on to the Silver Sun. Have you read Nancy Springer? The old fantasy stuff, not Sherlock Holmes as a teenage girl ones. I'm not discounting those. I haven't read them. I've got no opinion. Doesn't sound like my sort of thing, but you know, one day I'll be in the mood and I'll read it. Have you read Nancy Springer as she was in the 80s, 90s, and up to the 2000s when she wrote fantasy, Arthurian style fantasy, Tolkien style fantasy? I'm calling it that. No one else has. Or possibly Celtic mythology, Celtic, Arthurian, Tolkien. Have I missed any? Yes, I have missed one. Whoever that classic writer was who had his Saxon maiden in the tower. Whoever that was, Springer has read him and I want to reread him. Please tell me who he is. Thank you for listening to a very rambling video. I normally prepare for these videos, but there was nothing. There's no reviews of it online. There's no analysis. This is just pretty much off the bat. Thanks for watching. Read good books and tell me what you think of the books that I read.